I packed my suitcase believing I was going on a family vacation. By the time we arrived, I realized my son had driven past the resort and straight toward a nursing home I had never agreed to enter. He smiled, spoke gently, and told me it was temporary, but I could hear the relief in his voice as he left me behind. In that moment, it became painfully clear. I was no longer a mother to him, just a problem he needed out of the way. What he never expected was that I was still fully aware, still capable, and far from done with my life. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we are truly grateful to have you here. If you have not already, do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, get comfortable, maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a story you will not want to miss. Let us get started. My name is Margaret Maggie O'Connor. I was 69 years old when this story truly began, though at the time I believed I was standing quietly near the end of things, not at the edge of something new. I was a widow, a retired emergency room nurse, and a lifelong resident of Seattle, Washington. I lived alone in a modest house overlooking the gray-blue stretch of water where the sky always seemed to rest low, heavy with rain or possibility, depending on how you chose to look at it. My mornings followed a rhythm I trusted. I rose early, brewed strong coffee, and watched ferries cut through the bay while the city slowly woke up. I drove myself to the grocery store, carried my own bags, attended a senior yoga class twice a week, and volunteered at my church on Sundays. I had raised a son, survived the loss of my husband, and spent more than 4 decades making life and death decisions under fluorescent hospital lights. Nothing about my days felt fragile or uncertain. For 41 years, I worked as an emergency room nurse, the kind who learns to stay calm when everything falls apart. I had held strangers' hands as they took their last breaths and had pulled others back when the odds were stacked against them. Late in my career, I was invited to consult on a medical triage software system designed to reduce emergency room wait times. I contributed clinical insight, helped test its logic, and was compensated with a modest but steady royalty. It was never something I talked about much. I believe security spoke more loudly when it stayed quiet. Despite all of that, I defined myself most clearly as someone's mother. My son, Daniel O'Connor, was 42 and lived in San Francisco, California, where he worked as a financial advisor and real estate investor. I had poured everything into raising him after his father died, trusting that love and effort were investments that always paid off in time. Daniel often told people that his drive came from watching me work 12-hour shifts without complaint. I chose to believe that meant something. Daniel was married to Alyssa, a lifestyle influencer with a carefully curated online presence. Their home always looked pristine in photographs, their smiles perfectly timed. My grandchildren, Lucas and Emma, were the bright center of my world. Lucas, 15, was quiet and thoughtful, absorbed by computers and logic. Emma, 12, followed her instincts, her crayons, and her heart. Whenever they visited, the house felt warmer, fuller. That spring, Daniel invited me to join the family on a recreational vehicle road trip across several states, ending at Yellowstone National Park. The idea felt like a gift, a sign that I still belonged at the center of their lives. I told myself this was proof that growing older did not mean growing invisible. I packed carefully, hiking shoes broken in just enough, layered jackets for unpredictable weather, a 7-day medication organizer, my old notebook, its pages worn and familiar. I chose a compact backpack, not luggage that suggested dependence. I wanted to be ready, capable, and present. There had been small moments that unsettled me. Alyssa sometimes reminded me that long drives could be exhausting at my age. Daniel spoke more often about what might be best for me, rather than asking what I wanted. During video calls, I noticed pauses that felt practiced, smiles that arrived a second too late. My neighbor, Mrs. Patel, made an offhand comment about children who worried too much and nursing homes that promised everything and delivered very little. I smiled politely and dismissed it. Daniel was my son. I trusted him. On the morning I locked my front door and lifted my packed backpack, I felt steady, included, certain. I believed I still knew who I was and how the world worked. I had no idea that trust, like so many things, could be misplaced, or that the woman I thought I still was about to be tested in every possible way. If you're still watching and already sensing that something feels wrong in this family trip, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Because what I discovered next changed the meaning of that suitcase forever. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. Daniel arrived in Seattle early that morning, standing at the curb with a rental sport utility vehicle that looked far too large for one person and far too empty for a family trip. He hugged me briefly, the way someone does when their mind is already elsewhere, then took my backpack from my shoulder and placed it in the back without asking what was inside. I told myself not to read into small things. Parents are supposed to trust their children. That was the rule I had always lived by. The recreational vehicle was not there. Daniel said it had already started the journey east and that it made more sense for him to drive me part of the way before meeting Alyssa and the kids. His phone never left his hand. Messages lit up the screen, one after another, and every few seconds his thumb flicked across the glass while the engine idled impatiently beneath us. I slid into the passenger seat and buckled myself in, feeling oddly like a guest rather than a participant. As we pulled away from my quiet street, I watched my house disappear in the side mirror. I had left the windows closed, the dishes clean, the bed made. Everything was orderly, as if I were stepping out briefly, not vanishing into uncertainty. Daniel spoke little, and when he did, it was about logistics, schedules, and traffic. He did not ask how I felt or what I was most excited to see on the trip. The city thinned behind us, buildings giving way to trees and long stretches of road. I waited for the familiar signs pointing east, toward Idaho, but instead saw markers for cities farther south. At first, I doubted myself. Then the unease sharpened into certainty. We were going the wrong way. Daniel explained that there had been a change of plans, nothing serious, just a short stop to make sure everything was all right with my health. He spoke with the calm authority of someone who expected agreement, not discussion. The words were careful, padded with concern, yet each one suggested that my judgment could not be fully trusted. I sat quietly, absorbing the shift. Silence, I was learning, was being interpreted as permission. When we arrived at Cedar Ridge Senior Living in Tacoma, Washington, the building looked impressive enough from the outside. Wide glass doors, immaculate landscaping, a lobby designed to soothe anxiety. Inside, everything smelled faintly of disinfectant and artificial flowers. The calm felt rehearsed. Daniel guided me to the front desk and placed a clipboard in front of me. Paperwork, procedures, temporary arrangements. He urged me to sign quickly because time was tight. I did not have my reading glasses. I hesitated, then signed anyway. Trust, after all, had always been my default. While Daniel spoke with the receptionist, I noticed a computer screen behind the desk. My name was there, followed by unfamiliar terminology, words suggesting decline, supervision, placement. I listened more closely and heard references to long-term residency spoken in low, efficient voices. My chest tightened, though my thoughts remained painfully clear. Daniel returned with practiced reassurance. He told me this was for my rest, that he would take care of everything while I stayed a few days. Bills, accounts, decisions. The way he said it made those things sound final, already settled. He kissed my cheek, promised to call, and turned away before I could form the questions crowding my mind. I watched him walk across the parking lot without looking back. The doors closed behind him. The lobby felt suddenly vast and hollow. I sat alone, my backpack still at my feet, filled with hiking shoes meant for a place I would never see. In that quiet moment, the truth settled heavily around me. The family trip had never existed. I had not been invited along. I had been placed, carefully and deliberately, somewhere I had not chosen. And for the first time in my life, trust gave way to something colder and sharper: awareness. If you're still here and can feel the tension building beneath those polite smiles, comment number 2, so I know you're paying attention, because the next step my son took was not an accident. Let's move on to chapter 3. When the automatic door slid shut behind Daniel, the quiet inside Cedar Ridge grew heavier, as if the building itself had exhaled and left me holding the air. I remained seated in the lobby for a moment, my backpack against my ankles, hands folded neatly in my lap. From the outside, I must have looked composed, even agreeable. Inside, I was already cataloging details, the way I used to when a trauma patient arrived and the room went silent before the storm. A staff member approached with a practiced smile and led me through intake. A wristband was fastened around my arm. A schedule was explained in cheerful tones: meals, medication, activities, lights out. I nodded, absorbing the structure being placed around my day. Every movement felt efficient, calibrated, designed to remove the need to choose. As a nurse, I recognized the system immediately. This was not hospitality. This was containment. My room was down a long hallway that smelled faintly of cleaning solution and warm plastic. Inside, 2 single beds faced opposite walls. The other was already occupied. My roommate, Rosa, had soft gray curls and eyes that held more curiosity than confusion. She greeted me warmly, as though new arrivals were rare enough to be notable. Her laughter came easily, and within minutes she mentioned that her daughter had brought her here just for a little while after a fall. That little while, she added casually, had stretched into 3 years. I set my backpack in the corner near my bed. Its presence felt absurd, filled with items meant for motion, not this carefully controlled stillness. Along the walls, call buttons waited at arm's reach. A locked cabinet held medication. A small camera dome sat high in one corner, quiet and watchful. Everything about the room said permanence, no matter how softly the staff spoke about temporary stays. That afternoon, I tried to check my phone. Notifications had changed. Banking alerts no longer came through as expected. When I attempted to log into my account, access was limited. A message explaining that authorization settings had been updated. I sat back against the thin mattress, my pulse steady but deliberate. This was not accidental. Later, a nurse stopped by to confirm my medications. She referred to Daniel as my guardian, the word delivered without drama, as if it were a simple fact. Guardian. The term struck harder than any raised voice could have. I was asked to trust decisions made on my behalf, decisions I had not agreed to, for your safety and doctor approved, were repeated often enough to dull objection before it could form. I requested my patient file. The response was polite but evasive, assurances layered over delays. My training told me exactly what that meant. When transparency becomes inconvenient, authority hides behind procedure. As night settled in, the sounds of the building changed. Carts rolled, doors clicked. Someone coughed softly down the hall. The lights dimmed in stages, like a countdown. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling tiles, replaying Daniel's voice from earlier. He had sounded calm, organized, resolved. This had not been a decision made in haste. It had been prepared. I thought of how easily adulthood could be unfastened, not by force, but by paperwork and concern. How quickly competence could be questioned when age gave others permission to doubt it. The realization did not bring panic. It brought clarity. Somewhere near midnight, I rose quietly and sat at the small desk by the window. I began to list what I knew, what I remembered, and what I would need. Years in emergency rooms had taught me that survival depended on observation before action. I was no longer just a resident. I was a witness. At the end of the hallway, I heard the doors lock for the night. A soft sound, almost gentle. I understood then that the door had not closed on my life. It had closed from the outside, and that knowledge changed everything. If you're still watching and starting to realize this was not about care, but control, comment number 3 below. What happened next forced me to stop reacting and start observing. Now, let's move on to Chapter 4. Morning arrived at Cedar Ridge without ceremony. Lights brightened automatically, doors unlocked, and the hallway filled with the soft shuffle of slippers and carts. I rose with everyone else, folded my blanket, and followed directions exactly as they were given. That choice was not surrender. It was strategy. I had already learned that resistance came at a cost, while compliance invited invisibility. I attended breakfast at the assigned time, took my medication without comment, and listened as staff explained the day's activities. They smiled at me more when I agreed easily. I understood the rhythm quickly. Those who asked questions too often were managed. Those who obeyed were ignored. I chose the latter. Decades in emergency medicine had taught me that sometimes the safest place to think was beneath the radar. As the morning unfolded, patterns revealed themselves. Staffing thinned noticeably between meals. Residents without regular visitors waited longer for assistance. Requests framed as concerns were addressed. Requests framed as rights were postponed indefinitely. Everything was polite, efficient, and faintly neglectful. It was a system designed not to bruise, but to wear people down. During a late morning activity hour, I met Jim. He was seated near the window, observing rather than participating, his posture relaxed but alert. We exchanged pleasantries, nothing more. Yet I recognized something immediately. The way he listened, the way his eyes sharpened when staff passed. When he mentioned that he had once practiced estate law, the weight of the sentence lingered quietly between us. Jim had been brought here after signing documents he had trusted someone else to explain. Temporary, he had been told. Years had followed. We did not say much. We did not have to. Sometimes recognition alone is enough to build an alliance. That afternoon, I asked to schedule a video call with my grandchildren. The staff accommodated quickly, a tablet placed on a small table. Daniel joined the call before Lucas and Emma could speak freely. He smiled often, spoke for me, answered questions directed at me before I opened my mouth. When the call ended early due to scheduling constraints, I felt the truth settle in my chest. This was not connection. It was control. I realized then that nothing here was unsupervised. Conversations traveled. Observations were noted. Emotional reactions could be used later, categorized, analyzed, filed away. My instincts urged me toward silence. If I wanted to speak freely again, I needed to choose my moments carefully. Later, I noticed a sign-up sheet for the computer room. Limited hours, old machines, slow connections. The sign-up reason was optional. I wrote personal photos and waited my turn. When the time came, I walked in calmly and closed the door behind me. The computer took several minutes to load. I used that time to steady my breathing. When the screen finally appeared, I opened a new email and typed a message that was brief, factual, and deliberate. No emotion, no explanation, only names, location, and urgency. I sent it and logged out, my hands steady. Back in my room, Rosa was already asleep, her breath soft and even. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the backpack still untouched in the corner. For the first time since arriving, I felt something shift. I was still here, still thinking, still choosing. Silence, I had learned, was not absence. It was preparation. If you're still with me and wondering what I discovered once I stayed quiet instead of fighting back, comment number 4, right now, because what I uncovered next was something my son never expected me to see. Let's continue to chapter 5. Several days passed after I sent the email, days measured not by hours, but by vigilance. I slept lightly, woke easily, and listened more than I spoke. Cedar Ridge settled into a predictable loop, and predictability, I knew, was the best cover for secrets. I waited for a response, careful not to check my email too often, mindful that impatience could betray me faster than fear. When the reply came from Linda Park, it was brief and restrained, exactly as I expected. She did not promise rescue. She asked for facts, dates, names, anything verifiable. The tone told me she believed me, but belief alone was not enough. From that moment on, my days shifted from observation to collection. I paid closer attention to details most people had learned to ignore. Medication carts often ran light near the end of the week. Staffing charts posted in hallways did not match the number of employees actually on duty. Certain residents were marked as receiving services I never once saw delivered. As a nurse, I recognized patterns that did not align with honest care. As a woman trapped inside them, I recognized motive. Jim noticed too. During quiet moments in the common room, we exchanged looks rather than words. Once, while others watched a television game show, he leaned close enough to murmur that Cedar Ridge felt less like a care facility and more like an investment property. The phrase lingered with me long after he returned to his chair. The opportunity came unexpectedly. A shift change overlapped with a staff call-out, leaving the records office momentarily unattended. I had already seen where keys were kept and how often the lock was used more as a suggestion than a barrier. Timing mattered. Calm mattered more. Inside the office, filing cabinets stretched along one wall, labeled by category rather than by patient. I moved slowly, controlled. The files I first examined confirmed what I already suspected: billing inconsistencies, repeated service codes, identical documentation copied across residents who shared nothing but age. Then I found a different folder entirely, tucked where most eyes would never look. It contained corporate documents. Cedar Ridge Senior Living was not standing alone. It belonged to a larger network, managed and funded through layered companies designed to blur accountability. Lists of investors, board members, and silent partners followed. I recognized one name immediately: Daniel O'Connor, my son. The impact did not arrive as a wave. It was a drop of ice down my spine. Daniel was not just the man who left me here with reassurances and paperwork. He was part of the structure that turned vulnerability into profit. My placement had not been an inconvenience to be managed. It had been a transaction folded neatly into a balance sheet. I read until the words blurred. Medicare reimbursement forecasts, real estate holding strategies, language that referred to residents as long-term revenue stability. Every line stripped another layer from the version of my son I had chosen to believe in. This was not ignorance. This was design. I took photographs with steady hands, careful angles, no flash. Notes followed, written small, folded smaller. Evidence had weight now, and I felt its urgency pressing against my ribs. Leaving the office, I returned everything exactly as I had found it, the room erasing its own disturbance behind me. In the hallway, life continued. Meals were served, chairs were rearranged, laughter drifted in from the visitation area. I sat among them, composed, while something irreversible settled inside me. This was no longer about my freedom alone. Too many lives were woven into this web for me to slip quietly out and pretend nothing else mattered. That night, as I lay awake beneath the dim ceiling light, the choice formed clearly. Whatever came next would require more than endurance. It would require exposure. And with that knowledge, the risk ceased to scare me. Silence had protected me long enough. The night after I discovered Daniel's name in those files, sleep never fully arrived. I lay still, letting the reality settle into place piece by piece, careful not to rush the grief or the anger. Panic would have been easier. Panic burns fast and leaves little behind. What I felt instead was colder and steadier, shaped by certainty. I understood then that there was no quiet way out of Cedar Ridge anymore. Not for me, and not for anyone else whose life had been folded into that system. Linda Park contacted me again through the same narrow channel we had already established. Her message was precise and unsentimental. What I had uncovered went far beyond neglect or mismanagement. It pointed to organized, intentional abuse tied to insurance fraud and predatory guardianship practices. She did not soften the implications. Once this moved forward, it would involve investigators, prosecutors, and records pulled into public view. My name would not remain hidden. Neither would Daniel's. Becoming what Linda called a primary cooperating witness meant accepting that my testimony would trigger something irreversible. It meant the walls around Cedar Ridge would not simply crack, but collapse outward, drawing attention to every person involved. It meant subpoenas, courtrooms, headlines. It meant my son could face prison, not as an abstract possibility, but as a consequence with dates and sentences. After the message ended, I sat at the desk in my room for a long time without writing anything. I thought about Daniel as a child, about the way he used to count my steps when I walked him to school, about the pride in his voice the first time he said he wanted to be successful. I wondered when ambition had become entitlement and when love had turned into ownership. I had defended him for years, excusing sharp edges as stress, absence as dedication. Protection, I saw now, could rot into permission. I asked for another video call with my grandchildren. The request went through, though Daniel appeared immediately in the frame, positioned too carefully between Lucas and Emma. He spoke about management plans and responsibilities, about how everything was being handled so I would not worry myself unnecessarily. At one point, he referred to my house, my accounts, my savings, as though they were already settled matters. Assets, not choices. The word lodged in my chest and stayed there. When the call ended, my hands were cold, but my thoughts were clear. Whatever pain the truth would cause my grandchildren, that pain already existed. It had simply been hidden behind smiles and rehearsed concern. Silence would not protect them. It would only teach them that power went unchallenged. I sent Linda my response before doubt could reopen the door I had just closed. I told her I would cooperate fully. I authorized the use of every document I had gathered and agreed to testify to everything I had witnessed and uncovered. I asked for one thing in return, that Lucas and Emma be protected from retaliation, from leverage, from becoming collateral damage in a war they never chose. Linda confirmed that procedures were already in motion. Once formal statements were filed, the timeline would accelerate. Inspections would be scheduled. Warrants would follow. There was no more waiting. That evening, Cedar Ridge felt different. Nothing visible had changed, yet the air carried a tension I could almost taste. I walked the hallways with measured steps, outwardly compliant, inwardly resolved. I was no longer calculating escape routes. I was preparing for impact. As lights dimmed and doors locked for the night, I realized something unexpected. Fear had thinned. In its place was momentum. I had crossed a line not marked on any floor plan or file folder. I had chosen consequence over convenience, truth over preservation. The shape of everything had already begun to change. If you're still watching and asking yourself what happens when a mother chooses truth over protecting her own child, comment number 6 below. Because the moment I made that choice, everything began to collapse. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7. The first signs arrived quietly, almost politely. Staff meetings were called without explanation. Medication time shifted by minutes, then by hours. Hallway conversations stopped whenever a resident passed. Cedar Ridge did not announce its unraveling, but the building felt different, like a held breath that could no longer be sustained. Within days of my formal statement, the waiting ended. One morning, just after breakfast, unfamiliar cars began filling the parking lot. Men and women stepped out wearing badges instead of name tags, carrying clipboards instead of meal trays, state health inspectors, financial auditors, people who did not ask permission to move through locked doors. The tone of the building changed instantly. Offices were sealed, medication carts were halted mid-route and inspected. Staffing rosters posted on walls were compared against who was actually present, and the gaps were no longer dismissed as scheduling errors. Rooms meant only for administrators were opened and photographed. The carefully maintained calm collapsed under the weight of direct questions. Residents sensed it even if they did not understand it. Whispered conversations moved through the common areas like static. Some faces showed fear, others relief. Rosa took my hand as we watched inspectors review records near the nursing station. She did not ask what was happening. She simply squeezed my fingers, as if years of quiet endurance were finally being acknowledged. By midday, no one pretended this was routine. Phones rang unanswered at the front desk. Managers disappeared into closed rooms, their voices rising despite efforts to stay composed. The building that had controlled every movement now struggled to control its own narrative. That afternoon, news broke beyond Cedar Ridge. Television screens in the common room flickered with headlines naming the facility as part of a broader investigation into elderly abuse and insurance fraud. Reporters spoke of vulnerable populations, long-term care exploitation, and inflated billing practices. No one mentioned my name, not yet, but the structure Daniel had invested in was under scrutiny. By evening, his name was no longer a secret. I heard it first not from staff, but from another resident whose family followed local politics closely. Investors, board members, and financial backers were being questioned. Subpoenas were issued. Quiet partnerships that had thrived in invisibility were now being pulled into daylight. The betrayal that began as personal had fully crossed into public consequence. Alongside the institutional collapse came something I had not allowed myself to hope for too quickly. Linda informed me that my guardianship was being challenged in court. An independent psychological evaluation had been ordered to be conducted within 48 hours. For the first time since arriving at Cedar Ridge, autonomy felt like a nearing reality rather than a distant memory. That night, I sat awake listening to the building process its own uncertainty. Doors closed differently now. Footsteps hesitated. Authority no longer spoke in absolutes. The system had depended on compliance, silence, and routine. Once those cracked, nothing held firmly in place. The emotional weight arrived in waves: relief that the truth was moving, grief for those who would never see this moment, guilt for not recognizing sooner how far Daniel had gone, resolve hardened by the knowledge that none of this would have happened if silence had continued doing its job. Residents looked at one another differently now, no longer just neighbors sharing hallways, but witnesses sharing survival. No one cheered, no one celebrated, but the air felt less heavy, as if space had opened where there had once been walls. Near midnight, I walked past the administrative wing. The main office lights were off. Computers had been powered down, drawers emptied. What once felt untouchable now looked ordinary, diminished. Cedar Ridge was no longer sealed from scrutiny, and neither was I. The evaluation took place in a quiet office far from the noise Cedar Ridge had grown accustomed to hiding behind. No staff hovered, no family representatives observed. Two independent professionals asked measured questions, reviewed my medical history, tested memory, logic, reasoning. I answered calmly, without urgency, without performance. It was the simplest thing I had done in weeks, telling the truth about who I was and how clearly I understood my own life. The results came quickly. There was no ambiguity, no hedging language. I was deemed fully competent, mentally sound, and capable of managing my own affairs. The guardianship that had wrapped around me like invisible barbed wire began to unravel in plain daylight. It was not dramatic. It was procedural, but the impact felt seismic. At the emergency hearing that followed, I sat at the table and held the pen myself. Signing my own name again felt strangely intimate, as if I were reclaiming handwriting that had been taken from me along with agency. The judge's order restored my autonomy in full and added protective measures preventing any further interference from family members without court approval. For the first time since arriving at Cedar Ridge, decisions belonged to me again. That afternoon, I spoke to my grandchildren without anyone listening in. No administrator lingered near the door. No screen flickered with echoing voices. I did not recount every detail, nor did I soften the truth into something unrecognizable. I told them I was safe, I told them I had been wronged, and I told them that honesty mattered more now than comfort ever had before. Their relief came through the silence between words, rather than anything spoken. Daniel did not contact me directly. His reactions reached me through attorneys and written notices, filtered and formal. Explanations replaced apologies. Justifications replaced reflection. Whatever connection still existed between us had moved permanently into the realm of law. I mourned that loss quietly, without surprise. The man capable of explaining away my confinement was no longer someone I recognized as a son. Despite my restored freedom, I did not leave Cedar Ridge immediately. Walking away while others remained trapped inside the same mechanisms felt wrong. With Linda's guidance, I stayed long enough to ensure residents were reassigned properly, medical records transferred accurately, and families informed fully of what had occurred. Advocacy took the place of endurance. The role felt heavier, but it fit. Media requests began to arrive once my name surfaced in the investigation. I declined interviews at first, letting the facts speak while the authorities worked. When I finally agreed to make a statement, I did so on my own terms, with counsel present and no dramatics offered. I refused to be reshaped into a symbol unless I controlled the shape. The day I left Cedar Ridge, I did not rush. I packed slowly, intentionally. I thanked the few staff members who had behaved decently, even within a compromised system. I hugged Rosa and promised her I would not forget. When I walked through the front doors, no one stopped me. No one could. Outside, the air felt unfamiliar, as if I had been underwater longer than I realized. I stood for a moment without moving, letting autonomy settle into my bones rather than just my paperwork. Freedom was not loud. It was steady. As the car pulled away, Cedar Ridge shrank behind me, no longer a cage, but a building undergoing reckoning. I was not simply leaving a place. I was exiting a version of myself someone else had tried to finalize without consent. What came next would unfold publicly. But this moment, this quiet reclaiming of self, belonged only to me. If you're still here and want to see how this story finally ends, comment number 8 to let me know you stayed to the end, because the final outcome wasn't revenge, and it certainly wasn't forgiveness. Let's move to the conclusion. Freedom did not arrive with celebration. It arrived with paperwork, court dates, and a steady procession of consequences unfolding beyond my reach. Within weeks of my departure, Cedar Ridge was placed under state management, its leadership suspended pending investigation. Other facilities linked to the same corporate web followed. What had presented itself as isolated misconduct revealed a pattern that no one could dismiss as coincidence. I learned of Daniel's situation through official channels, not television screens. Charges were filed methodically: conspiracy, insurance fraud, exploitation of the elderly. The language was clinical, devoid of emotion, and yet each line felt heavier than the last. I did not read the documents all at once. I took them in pieces, careful not to confuse justice with shock. This was not a story anymore. It was a record. Motherhood complicates reckoning. I replayed moments I once defended as growing pains or ambition. Long hours, sharp decisions, the habit of framing people as processes. I could trace the slope now, gentle at first, then steep. Responsibility weighed on me, but I refused the comfort of rewriting history to absolve myself or to condemn myself entirely. Loving a child does not require blindness. Too often, I had chosen it anyway. Lucas and Emma felt the aftermath in ways adults rarely do. Whispers at school, curious glances, questions framed as concern. I did not shield them with half answers. We talked openly, not lingering on details, but refusing denial. Trust, I learned, grows best when it is not asked to carry secrets. Our evenings found a rhythm again. Homework at the table, meals shared without phones, the quiet comfort of routines returning. The public narrative tried to simplify me. Headlines spoke of bravery, of resilience, of a woman standing up to betrayal. I read none of it. Applause felt misaligned with the reality I carried. There was nothing victorious about watching systems tear themselves open under scrutiny, nothing triumphant about seeing my own son reduced to a case file. Justice, when it works, extracts payment from everyone involved. I made it clear through counsel that my actions were not fueled by revenge. The facts supported themselves. My purpose had been protection and accountability, not punishment for punishment's sake. I accepted that separating those motives mattered, especially to the children watching how power responded when challenged. When asked about the future, I chose precision. I would remain involved, but not as a figurehead. I agreed to advise oversight committees and consult on policy changes where experience mattered more than visibility. I refused invitations that asked me to perform my pain for education. Purpose, I decided, did not require exposure. At home, quiet returned in small, ordinary increments. The kettle warming in the morning, shoes by the door, groceries planned for the week. Normality rebuilt itself patiently, brick by brick. I stood one evening at the kitchen window, watching the light fade, and understood something I had not while trapped inside institutional walls. Truth carries a cost, but concealment charges interest. I had paid mine. The bill was steep, yet the alternative would have hollowed us all out in time. I was no longer defined by what had been done to me, nor by who had done it. What remained was the work of meaning. A year has passed since I walked away from Cedar Ridge. and time has softened the sharpest edges without erasing what matters. Investigations concluded, lawsuits settled, headlines disappeared. The world moved on, as it always does. Yet for me, life did not close a chapter. It opened one I had never expected to write at this age. I have spent many quiet mornings thinking about how easily society confuses endurance with decline. How quickly people assume that once a woman's hair turns gray, her opinions lose urgency, her experiences lose relevance, and her choices become negotiable. We are praised for being agreeable, for not demanding too much space, for accepting what we are given with gratitude. Few stop to ask whether acceptance is truly consent. When my son placed me in that facility, he believed he was solving a problem. He believed my life had narrowed, that my story had reached its natural conclusion, and that it was now safe for others to decide what was best for me. What he failed to understand was that age does not erase identity. It compresses it. Everything I had ever been was still present, refined by time rather than diminished by it. I think often of the people I left behind, not in sorrow alone, but in respect. They were not weak. They were layered with decades of memories, work, love, and loss. Yet they had become almost invisible inside systems designed to profit from patience and silence. Their greatest mistake was trusting that kindness would be enough to protect them. Justice arrived imperfectly, as it always does. Accountability did not heal every wound it exposed. Some relationships fracture beyond repair. Some regrets could not be rewritten. I learned that truth does not promise comfort, only clarity. And clarity, while honest, can be lonely. What gave meaning to everything was not punishment or public acknowledgement. It was refusal to disappear quietly, refusal to accept dignity as something conditional, refusal to let fear dictate the rest of my life simply because the calendar suggested I should be done becoming. My grandchildren understand that now. They saw firsthand that love does not require self-erasure and that respect should never depend on age or convenience. They learned that doing what is right may cost you comfort, reputation, or even family, but it gives you something far more enduring: alignment with yourself. I live differently now. I choose my commitments carefully. I speak plainly. I walk away from conversations that shrink me and invest in those that expand understanding. I no longer measure my worth by how useful I am to others, but by how honestly I inhabit my own life. If this story leaves you with anything, let it be this: aging is not the opposite of relevance. It is proof of survival. Each year adds depth, not emptiness. We do not fade because we grow older. We fade when we are ignored, dismissed, or taught to believe our voices no longer matter. I refuse that lesson, and I hope you do too. In the end, this is not a story about betrayal or punishment, but about awakening. It reminds us that dignity does not expire with age, and that silence is often mistaken for weakness when it is simply patience waiting for truth. Life does not shrink as the years pass. It gains weight, depth, and meaning. What truly defines us is not how quietly we endure injustice, but whether we choose to stand when standing becomes difficult. Every experience, every loss, every hard-earned insight becomes part of our voice, and that voice deserves to be heard until the very last moment. If this story moved you or made you think of someone in your own life, thank you for staying with it to the end. Stories like this exist to be shared, reflected on, and discussed. Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments, share your perspective, and join the conversation. And if you would like to hear more stories about resilience, truth, and quiet strength, please follow and subscribe. Your support truly means more than you know,